Hello and welcome to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs. My name is Robert Milton. I'm the chair of the arts firm here at the club here. Thank you all virtually this afternoon for joining us for a moderated panel discussion on balancing public safety, civil liberties in the age of technology. A moderated panel discussion bringing together law enforcement, criminal justice reform, experts, academia, the business community, and the media to engage in honest, nuanced dialogue about the intersection of technology, public safety, and civil liberties. This topic is currently being discussed on many fronts in the age of technology innovation, especially in San Francisco since the passage of Proposition E in 2024. The topic raises many questions that will be addressed by our speakers this afternoon. How should new technologies be evaluated and overseen? What transparency and accountability measures make sense? And what can San Francisco experience teach other cities considering similar approaches? Our speakers are Chief Derek Liu, San Francisco Police Department, Barry Friedman, professor of NYU of Law, founding director of policing projects, and Marissa Rodriguez, the CEO of Union Square Alliances. The moderator is Megan Cassidy of the San Francisco Chronicle. I'll now turn over the program to our moderator. All right.
Thanks for that. Hello to everybody. Thank you for being here. So I think a lot of the discussion today is going to be centered on the San Francisco Police's, I'd say, relatively new real-time investigation center. So Chief Liu, I was wondering if you could just give a little bit of background on the origin of that. What does the unit do, and also, just as importantly, what does it not do?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. I would say the Real-Time Investigation Center really is a coordination center, obviously in real time, of many assets to include our technology assets like license plate reader, drones, our video capabilities. But more than that, it coordinates our ground assets in conjunction with those tools. So we think that we've made a lot of positive impacts on community safety via the Arctic, as we call it. It's really important to know that we have made a lot of strides. I think really it was born of our auto boost epidemic, but it has since really positively impacted crime across the board, all categories. So it's had tremendous growth, really tremendous impact across the board, across crime categories. But we do deal with misinformation, to your point. I think it's really important for people to know, the common things that I hear are, we monitor folks, and that's just not the case. Every time we fly a drone or every time we access video, it is in association with a criminal investigation. So I think it's important to know that, we aren't watching you, so to speak. We don't share our information with immigration, which are a lot of the common concerns that I hear, especially here in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there are 3 new pieces of technology that really kind of launched around the same time that are kind of the key players in this: drones, the Flock license plate readers, and the mobile camera units. Would you say is that about correct?
Well, first you're right. So license plate readers, drones, and then it's really the ability to tap into our partner camera networks.
Yeah.
We don't own these cameras. A lot of the camera networks, for example, the Union Square bid that I'm sure Marissa can speak to, allows us to tap into video feeds. And I think it's important to note here that it's very rarely is it ever a live monitoring situation. The vast majority of the time, we're actually accessing what's in real time historical data.
Yeah. Do you have any? Can you play favorites? Which piece of technology do you think has been the most useful for police?
It's hard. That's really a difficult question to answer. I would say it really is the melding of all the technologies that's kind of the secret sauce with ground units, and then the real-time coordination that ARTIC gives us, kind of like, a quarterback, offensive coordinator, that sort of thing.
And so, as I'm sure you all are aware, crime is measurably down in San Francisco, and I think not just measurably, but you can see it with your eyeballs too. You go to Union Square, you go to the Tenderloin, Soma. It's like night and day, especially working around there during COVID time. And so this is a question for Barry. How much do you think that we can attribute that drop in crime to this new wave of technology, and what are other factors that could play into it?
Sure, Megan. So, I'm going to lay out a framework that I use to think about these problems. It's pretty common sense, and it starts by asking, what are the benefits that you get out of a new technology that you're using? And then, of course, if there are benefits, you then have to talk about costs and risks. But if there are no benefits, you save a lot of work. So the question is, how do we figure out what are the benefits? So with all of these technologies, and they're powerful technologies. I mean, when you think about drones that can chase suspects or cars, and you think about license plate readers that store a year of data about where you've gone over the course of the year, that's why the police want to use them, because they're powerful. And so you want to ask, are there real benefits to these tools, and then what are their risks, if there are any of them? So I can think of 3 benefits you might get. Chief might add more, but one of them is, to apprehend suspects. The second will be to deter people from committing other crimes because they know the technology is in use. And then the third, which is a little complicated, but I think whenever you think about benefits or costs, you have to think not about only the hard costs, but the social benefits, is a perception on the part of the community that they're safer because the tools are there. So then you say, okay, so how do we know if we're getting those benefits? And that's tough to figure out. There are, again, 3 ways I think that you can figure it out. One is anecdotes. Most cops that I talk to will say that there were, a license plate reader helped them crack a case. I've been in the Arctic. I've seen situations where those tools are useful. There's also crime rates, which you pointed out. And then finally, there's kind of rigorous study. And I'll just a word on each of them. So the anecdotes are important. They're real. I think anybody who looks at these technologies and doesn't like them and thinks, what's the point? I'm convinced that there's some value to these technologies. Crime rates is tricky because crime rates are going down all over the country. In some crime areas, San Francisco has had notable drops. That is certainly true. But lots of things affect crime. Like, I've studied this for many years, and it's rarely one thing that's made the difference. It could be the technology. It also could be a mayor who's committed to changing the structure of the city and the way that we address public safety. A lot of the economy. The one thing I wish San Francisco would do, I wish any city would do, because we would learn a tremendous amount from it, is to do a really rigorous study, which social scientists can do, to compare the situation with the technologies and in their absence, and figure out what kind of a bump are we getting. Not just, it seems like it's helpful, and the police certainly believe that, and I would agree with you, by the way. I was in the city right after the pandemic was ending, and it's night and day to be here now. But I think we would all benefit, and San Francisco wants to be a leader in this area by getting the folks who do that kind of work. We don't do it at the Policing Project, though we know a lot of people that do, and really trying to figure out what's the value add that we're getting out of these technologies.
And so, I'm sorry, it's Marisa or Marissa?
Marissa.
Marissa, thanks. So you've been in ground zero of some of these new kind of revolutionary changes with technology in Union Square. Can you give us a snapshot of what crime looked like, I'd say 5 years ago versus now, and what do you think has really driven those changes?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really excited about this conversation. I think it's certainly interesting to kind of study these effects. So to your point, Union Square, the heart of San Francisco, where business is concentrated around retail, hospitality, hotels, restaurants, everything. And I think what we very quickly learned was that perceptions play a role in some of this. Narrative plays a role in some of this. People's feeling around being safe plays a role. But what we're hearing is that we're hearing numbers, and those numbers specifically around the neighborhood that I am overseeing is 40%. We're hearing a lot of 40%, and a 40% reduction in certain crime types. And I think our chief alluded to the car break-ins being one, retail theft being another, very specific. And so when I think about propping up technology, for us, and especially coming out of the COVID and the pandemic, and in line with what we were just discussing nationwide as a conversation, for us, we are seeing something very directly correlated to the ability to commit crime. We were seeing a trend nationwide where policing got very challenged. It was very hard to get police officers. We lost a number of police officers, but we saw technology was be a force multiplier and create an opportunity to say, okay, within these parameters, and San Francisco has done a really good job of making sure there are guardrails around this. This has been a conversation that has been over, at least for us, over 10 15 years having this conversation, starting with surveillance technology, then moving into drone technology, moving into live feeds. To your point, our camera network is completely tapped into the Real-Time Investigation Center. What does that mean? Well, we don't have capacity to look at real-time video all day long. We just don't do it. The police department doesn't either, but when it matters, it matters. And it's in that moment that matters. And so we're starting to see real results, turning around like I said, real results, but that are showing us that this technology is really having an impact on their ability to police. I think most importantly, it has allowed us to slow the frame, right? So what does that mean for us? It means, and when I say us, I think of law enforcement. I come at this from a former law enforcement background, I'm a former prosecutor, so for me, I speak to it in that way, but it allows the opportunity for very thoughtful, intentional policing, which I think is an important perspective in all of this. So while we're thinking about, protecting civil liberties, and we're thinking about all of the conversations around technologies around policing, we're also talking about, well, what does it do to ensure that you're actually able to perform your job safer for the public, more thoughtfully for the public, more intentionally, and more targeted. And I think that's the conversation we should be having more and more of today, because that's what we're seeing. We're getting the individual in the moment. A drone gets released. I think that's the most exciting technology, by the way.
Hey, you do play favorites. Yeah.
I asked if I could actually operate it. They told
I
me
did
no.
one too.
They told me no. So they have safeguards in place, right?
Okay.
So, but this thing pops up. It's chasing, the guy that did the crime, and that's specific. And that means there's fewer police officers that have to be taken offline. There's fewer, challenges with, okay, now it's a lineup and now it's a this, and we know all of what that means with respect to law enforcement and policing over the years, right? And so I think it's just been a really exciting time here in San Francisco, a perfect case model, because we are very intentional here.
Yeah.
We do try to be as thoughtful as possible. We do take the time. And it's been exciting to be a part of the conversation post Prop E, because I think that's when we saw this really take foot. And at a time when we're still trying to build up the police department, I think it's been a great tool to have, and we are seeing tangible results.
Yeah. I'm wondering, on the privacy angle, I know that probably the Real-Time Investigation Center, and you being in San Francisco, I'm sure that the department is flooded with new technologies that would allow you to surveil people very, very easily. And I'm wondering, this is actually a question for all of you. Should there be a line in the sand where, no, we don't want our local police department doing that? And what would be the reason why?
I guess I'm the bummer on the stage. Because everybody's pro-technology here, and I'm going to bring up things that maybe should give us a little pause, so I will do that. But your question, the way you framed it, actually is very useful, because, in the work that we do around civil liberties, there's no, our position is that it's rare to come into contact with any technology that you just say, absolutely not, like we're not going to use it. You want to start by asking, is this technology going to make us safer? I want to be as safe as anybody, my kids and my family. And then you have to ask, okay, but what are the risks? And you have to then look at those risks. And even then, you don't say, well, we're not going to do it because there's a threat of some sort to privacy, or I'm going to name some other things. But you ask, is there a way to put regulation in place? Is there a way to put guardrails in place that can actually let us squeeze the benefits out of the technology and avoid the harms? And that requires a consciousness about the harms. So I'm going to go down a list now, the bummer list, I guess, for this group. So, I'm going to start in a place that people often don't. They often start with the P word, privacy. But, one of the things that goes wrong a lot with these technologies is, you might not know this or believe this, but police departments get hacked all the time, and the data is held for ransomware. And so all the data that's collected, and I'm going to talk about that data, is vulnerable to people hacking in. Some officers, hopefully a small number, but it's persistent. I think it was the Washington Post had a big story on this the other day. Abuse it. It's like, I want to know where my romantic partner is. I've got an ability to do that. Again, something you can build safeguards into the system, but it's important to do that. Then there's surely privacy. There's a question of where some of the technologies are sited and whether they're, because of their location, affecting some communities, often marginalized communities more than others. There are concerns, again, about data security, over-criminalization. If you've got the tools and you're using them for a lot of minor offenses, you're just going to bring more people into the criminal justice system, which is very expensive to do, and something we all would prefer not to do if we didn't have to do it. And then this one's going to maybe strike all of you as a little weird, but I think it's really important to be aware of it, which is authoritarianism. So we're collecting enormous amounts of data on everybody, not necessarily the city, but other cities, the federal government, like enormous amount of data on everybody. I've written about this, and I do think that there's the technology available to pretty much know everything about everyone all the time if you want to. And we've seen, around the world, and even here in the United States over history, that if you've got a government that has a problem with a group or wants to do something to that group, there's nothing quite as good as having a list of who and where everybody is. That would be true in Nazi Germany or Cambodia at times, or the Japanese-American exclusion here in the United States. And we're seeing it happen now. I mean, we've got a federal government that is conducting enforcement of people exercising their lawful rights to protest what the government's doing and labeling them domestic terrorists. And we're living in an age where we're maybe all a little inured to that, but that's kind of a crazy thing to tell somebody that they're domestic terrorists, and ICE agents showing up at people's homes and saying, we know you've been at protests. And so that's stuff we should worry about. It's too much power. I'm a constitutional law professor, and I think the framers of the Constitution would have done backflips if they'd known some of the things that we're doing. And again, I'm not saying don't do some of it, but for example, license plate readers, they collect data on where everybody goes, and then one of the big questions is retention. How long are you holding that data? And so you can regulate that. You can say how long the retention period is going to be. And those are the kinds of questions I think that we need to ask in a penetrating way about the use of these technologies, because they're advancing with breathtaking speed. I've also watched the drones go up and the effect of them, and it's terrific if you want to catch somebody who's committed a serious crime, but you have to think about what you're concerned about.
One thing I was wondering about too is I remember about 6 years ago, San Francisco was among the first cities in the country to outright ban facial recognition technology. But now, all kinds of AI technology has become democratized. And is that something that police would have to consider as well? Like, if everybody else can use this technology, should we be adopting it as well? Just keeping up with the curve.
I think that's a great point. I'm sorry, Chief.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, and to your point, right, it's kind of what is out there and what exists in reality. I mean, I had to silence my phone. I walk around with this thing that has basically all this information you're talking about, and it is about regulation and making sure that we are solving the problem that you allude to, like what is it that we're trying to get to and what can we do with the least, invasive approach, and what we can all feel comfortable around. I actually don't think today could we use facial recognition technology and maybe get to the answer faster? Probably. Is it 1,000% necessary? No, not right now. I mean, we've solved crimes for forever, maybe not exactly perfectly, right, as we know, and this could potentially help it be more perfect. But we're looking, I think, more for patterns or for, behaviors or something that just seems a little off the norm, and kind of how do we dig into that and make sure that things are safe for everyone. And I think we're balancing that also against our economic bottom line as well. I think about San Francisco, I think about a Union Square in particular that was so negatively hit by, a bad narrative or crime or whatever that was happening, that it took such a toll on our city's ability to even thrive. So where is that balance, and where do we feel comfortable? And I think there are moments in history where, oh, bam, we have this moment where a spike in technology, this thing shifts, it shifts our perceptions, it shifts our comfortability, with certain technologies. I mean, there are moments still today when I open my phone and it's like, please enter and you're like, what? That's weird, I don't want to do that. But we get to these places and these humps and we continue to grow with it. But to your point, I do think it's really, really important that we maintain these safeguards. We have communication, transparency, in dialogue. We've been doing that every step of the way. We don't have to rush the process because we've come so far. I think at this point we can take some time in making sure we're doing this and approaching it the right way. No better place than a place like, I think, San Francisco, where that matters to us in conversation. But we also, again, need to balance that with, we cannot pass go without clean and safe when it comes to economic development. We cannot thrive if people don't feel like they are safe in environment. You cannot have innovation if you don't feel you're safe in environment. There's so many things, and to your point, there are a lot of risks involved in this. Over the many, many generations, it hasn't stopped our government from doing heinous things and figuring it out, right? And at this point, absolutely, we're all essentially vulnerable when it comes to information, and we can get hacked at any moment. But I do think working to ensure that people are part of the conversation. And I think the business community is a great one, because on the one hand, you as a resident, as a worker, as someone trying to innovate in the city, want to feel safe doing that. But you also, on the flip end, feel the same pressures about wanting to be in a space where, you have a right to all the rights afforded anyone through process, whatever that due process might be, and that you're not having that impeded by technology, right, in the wrong way.
Yeah, just to address your original question, I think that, if you asked me to name a particular technology where we draw that line in the sand, I don't think I could come up with an answer for you. But I agree with what I think both Barry and Marissa have talked about, is it requires, I think, a measured approach to, maybe you don't look and implement a V1 of a particular technology or product, right? You have to sit and see where it iterates, where it evolves. But also to touch on what Barry kind of spoke to, I actually agree with a lot of what he talks about. I think whenever you approach a new technology, there should be some sort of framework that you go by. For us, I really look at, again, a balance test of, like, operationally, is it sound? What does it impact? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Secondly, is there a policy that is, in conjunction with that, whatever that technology is, that properly balances San Francisco values with what we're trying to do on the street in a common sense way? Then is there a proper education component? Because I think that all this stuff is just wrought with a lot of misinformation of, obviously they're monitoring, or obviously they're watching where my car goes every day, which is just not the case. And then that last piece is, there needs to be a good, solid foundation for compliance. So what are you doing? Are we just flying by the seat of our pants, or are we auditing what we do? Are we logging what we do? Are we being transparent with that? Because, to be perfectly transparent, there's been speed bumps along the way. And that's kind of, I think, a little bit of a given, that what you get with technology is it moves at warp speed. So I think that we've had issues with LPR before, but we caught some of these issues with a very robust audit process.
I actually was wondering if you could, there was an example that happened, it was a few weeks ago. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, with our license plate reader system, we have a built-in audit system process that we do on a regular basis. And in one of our audits, we discovered that one of our partners, and we share information with California partners. We're not allowed to share with out-of-state or federal law enforcement. But in one of our audits, we discovered that a particular entity that we lawfully shared with was sharing with an unapproved entity. So we were the first ones in California to find that issue. Immediately upon finding it, we cut off that access, and we created a new way to do business, so to speak. So we figure out a way how to move forward with it. But again, I mean, these are safeguards that we've put in. We want people to know that if there's something that goes wrong, that we are transparent about it. Number one, and number two, we move to rectify the situation quickly, and then how do we do business afterwards?
And do we know what I mean, it was federal authorities that ended up accessing this data, correct?
Out of state and federal authorities.
And do we know what they were trying to do?
It was really so it was our NCRIC, so for a fusion center. Our understanding was that their analysts did not understand that we had these policies in place. When they were doing case workups for out-of-state agencies, they provided LPR information that may have hit other agencies, including our databases. We did confirm no immigration enforcement, and they were more violent crime in nature.
Megan, if I can just, policing's changed in a way that pretty dramatically over the last few years that most people are unaware of. So the model of policing, back when the chief was not a chief, but a patrol officer and investigator, was very much case-oriented. Something had happened or something was happening, and you were looking for a suspect, and that's where your focus was. And as Marissa was saying, and it's true of the license plate readers, it's now this data collection on all of us. Like, that's the big change. It isn't we have a reason to think you've done something wrong, and now we're going to focus on you. But we're all aware of this because we're living in this data-rich environment. Just like we're throwing advertisements at everybody else, we are collecting everyone's data. As Marissa says, her cell phone, her apps are providing information about her all the time. And then data brokers buy that data, and then they sell it to everybody, people that want to sell you ads, but also law enforcement agencies, less at the local and state level than at the federal level. And that data gets aggregated. And so in a sense, we potentially could all be suspects. And that's what worries me the most, which is that we need to figure out ways to make sure that all of our private lives don't become fodder for investigative. Some places are experimenting with predictive algorithms. Can you take this data and figure out where there is something that's not quite right? And those algorithms are not very good. They're not very reliable, and people can get caught up in that. And so I really think that's the kind of thing we just need to be conscious of. Again, it's not to say don't do some of this, though I do have my dread about means that collect all of our data and hold it for a long period of time. That's something I would regulate very closely. But again, it's just the question of guardrails and regulation. And as the chief says, it's moving really fast. So it's hard. When I talk to police chiefs everywhere, they're all like, I feel like a vendor's throwing something at them, all the time. And here's a new thing you could do. And it's way ahead of what we're in a position to actually regulate or think about sensibly.
Just to be clear, we don't sell our data to just putting it out there.
Good catch. I know, and I just want to go back to what you were saying in the beginning too, which is like, what are we solving for? And I think if we stay focused on what we're trying to address, which is safety, public safety, specific around certain crime types, how can we put in those safeguards? I think one of the things we need to be focused on more is actually, we just talked about a 40% drop in crime. So what does that mean? That means there's a deterrence effect, right? That means that what are we actually preventing? I know that you had mentioned, Barry, this concept of, more technology means we can maybe apprehend more and more and more criminals all at once. But I think if anything, what we're seeing is the opposite. We're seeing we are targeting, we are more narrow, we are more focused, and we are seeing people say, that's not the place to commit crime, I'm not going to do that. And so that, in essence, is prevention. And I think if we can balance, it's this constant balancing act, and making sure we're doing that. We need those cost-benefit analysis at every step of the way, and just making sure that we are taking a scalpel to it and being precise and saying, this is what we need, how can we get there? Do we need to be so fancy with all the bells and whistles? No, I don't think so. I think we can get there with a lot of what we have. And it's already showing that it's being effective, and it's allowing the policing to have space to actually police and do the investigative work and to be really thoughtful about it versus like reactive. Let's be more proactive than reactive.
I think what Marissa just said was such an important point. I don't think the goal is to get to zero and arrest everyone at all. I think the deterrent effect is huge. I think the narrative behind it is huge. I look at the I think what Marissa's talking about is the precision factor that comes with this technology. I mean, I look back to, 20 years ago when I was a brand new cop. If I went to, pick your crime, a robbery or whatnot, I mean, literally it was kind of just this, okay, can you describe what happened? Can you describe the vehicle? Can you describe the suspect? And you put this description out there, and we stop, a whole bunch of cars, hoping that that is, in fact, the suspect. Fast forward to 2026, you now can, go back to real-time historical video. Yep, this is what happened. This is actually the real suspect description, can get pumped out to the police officers that are now responding. A real license plate that's connected to that crime. You can hot list it in our license plate readers. I mean, what you end up doing is launching a drone, and you end up stopping the right car. And I think the impact of that is a couple things. Number one, it makes for a heck of a prosecution. Number two, maybe you recover that person's stolen goods right then and there. And the last part is just really the legitimacy behind you stopped the right car and the right person. You didn't have 10 other people who were not involved have a negative contact with the police. And then the flip side of it is people that engage in this activity. I mean, we've seen this already, people going on podcasts and, probably like a talk show like this, speaking about, ooh, don't do this in San Francisco. So it's powerful.
Yeah. I think it might be helpful to talk about what are the brass tacks? What goes into when a vendor comes and says, I have this shiny new technology, who does it go to? Who gets to decide whether it's adopted? Is there oversight on that? Maybe you could walk me through how, I don't want to give away any secret sauce that you're working on now, but how has this worked in the past?
I mean, we get approached, to your point, all the time on new technology, and we take a very measured approach to listening to what's out there. We the way it worked with our Arctic, we went out and visited other places in the country that had successful programs and saw what they were doing. We took bits and pieces of what we liked, what we thought would fit, again, relative to San Francisco values, and said, I think this is something that we can move forward with, and that San Francisco's would agree is a viable thing to move forward. And then there's a process where we develop policy and slowly start to implement. Prop E made things a lot more, I would say, efficient. I think the old path was many boards, public meetings, et cetera, et cetera. And now we can do a pilot program quite quickly with safeguards, with a solid policy, collect data on whether it worked, and then kind of go back to the original process.
But I think the culture was established too, that I think is very important, that there is one where, yes, it was really onerous at a time. I think it might still, there's still moments where it feels that way. But it's what helped you get to a place with detecting that perhaps our safeguards made the wrong turn. But that's just because culturally, I think we are very careful about ensuring that each step and thinking about, well, what if this can get in this person's hand and on and on. But at the same time, back to balancing, right? Because on the one hand, I have my phone. And on my phone, I have made the decision at different turns, I'm going to click, and I'm going to say yes. And if a profile was made on probably just about every step I took, and it was shown today, I'd probably be quite embarrassed, but at the same time, whatever. That was a decision I made. If I'm the victim of a crime and I'm, laying there waiting for somebody or something to happen, and there are all these steps and safeguards and this thing and then that thing and then this thing and then that thing that prevent law enforcement to get to what it is that I need in that moment, I'm going to be pretty disappointed today in particular, right? Knowing that wait a minute, I live in a world in the center of technology, and why is this so hard, right? So I think, again, back to that sort of balancing and figuring out what are we trying to solve for? How do we get to that? How do we ensure that at the end of the day, we're creating an environment that feels safe for all of us to thrive, that feels that we're not being over-policed, that we're not being over-surveyed, all of those things. And I think it's a constant dialogue in its communication and its transparency at every step.
So I agree with everything the Chief and Marissa have said about this. I'm going to play both sides of the fence. So if you're unhappy with where I'm going in one direction, just be patient
wait-
for a minute.
wait a
I'm going to go in the other direction too. I do. I've looked at some of the policies in the city, and we're going to help the city, I think, improve some of the policies, and we're eager to do that. I think Prop E did some good things and some bad things, so let me talk about both of them. Prop E's conception was that, there'd be a pilot period, but it's a year, and then I'm going to explain the other side of the fence why that's even more complicated. It's a long time for a pilot. The city's got a drone policy, it does, but it lets data be retained, I think, for too long, and it doesn't say anything about drones flying over private property and what happens with that. Became a big issue in New York because I'm actually a fan of drones as first responders because, if you think of dispatchers and 911 calls, they're blind. I mean, they're listening to what's going on, but they can't see it. And if you can get a drone there often faster than you can get a patrol car there and get eyes on a situation, and it might be a crime, but it also could be somebody in medical distress or something like that's terrific. But the NYPD was using drones as first responders, but then keeping all the footage, passing over everybody's property, and it was a big hullabaloo. And the trick here, and I think that the Chief and Marissa understand this, is it's all about trust. Right now, everybody's bullish about the technology in San Francisco. I mean, I look at the polling numbers, and it's quite extraordinary, actually, how everybody's excited about the technology. But, as anybody who's worked in the policing world for any period of time, then something goes wrong or two things go wrong, and all of a sudden the trust starts to fall. And it is about transparency, and it is about having safeguards in place. Again, the license plate reader policy here, I think that the city holds the data for too long. I don't think it's necessary to hold the data that long. And one way to protect against a lot of the things I discussed is just to retain the data for a smaller period of time.
And I'm
Now-
sorry, and how long does it retain?
It's a year here, I think, in San
1 year.
Francisco. And Flock, for example, which is getting a lot of grief, and in part because we advised them, the policing project some time ago, to have a transparency portal. So they're all for transparency until it turns out that if you're a little too transparent, everybody knows what's going on, and then they're unhappy. I've noticed that nobody's complaining about any of the other license plate reader companies, which are often doing things that are, I find, even more troubling. But I'm going to play the other side of the fence because I do think it's important to be candid about this, which is, keeping policy up to date is a lot of work. And with the speed the technology is moving, it's almost impossible. And this city had, and I think still does have, a very onerous system of trying to keep those policies up to date. And what we see, all over the country is if you impose requirements that the PD just can't keep up with, they just stop trying. In New York, we have a statute that required a certain amount of transparency, and it was sufficiently onerous that eventually the PD was just using boilerplate because they just couldn't examine the policies fast enough. You have to figure out which technologies really need to focus and which ones just don't. It's not worth going through all of that. And so I think one way to make the policy process work better and have the policies you need is to not make it so hard to formulate the policies and then get them approved.
Yeah.
And I do think San Francisco, even now after Prop E, has challenges.
One thing you mentioned, and it's something I'm just curious about, is why do you think that there has been so much controversy really in other places around the country, but it feels to me like San Francisco has in recent years really embraced technology in the law enforcement realm. Is that your sense as well?
I mean, look, we're all living in a world that was unimaginable to us 10 years ago. And we're all I'm an early adopter of technology because it's really cool until it all stops working, which has been my life over the last few weeks, and then it's not as cool. And I think San Francisco aspires to adopt technology, and I think measured is the right word, but in a way that's very focused. And I think it's interesting what the city's done, and it's really would like to be a model for the country in that regard. And I think it's important, as we've seen all over the country, because particularly flock fires just breaking out everywhere, that you need to keep your guardrails up to date with your policies, and that's hard to do. It's really, really hard to do, and people can get impatient with that, but I think that's what needs to happen. Also, by the way, I'll just point out, the vendors are pushing this technology very quickly, and when they come and they show you, the show and tell, it's like, well, that's really cool. I was on the floor of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. They have this incredible exposition hall, and you sort of wander around and get shown all the new stuff that's coming, and it's all like, wow. But
Can you give a couple examples?
Well, I wandered into a booth of one of the license plate reader companies and, played very dumb and got them to show me, like in my neighborhood where people had been moving around and how they'd been moving around. And there's an ability to have remarkable precision about some of that, which, again, I think is something we should all care about. But there are ways for most of these things to write policies in a way that we don't have to worry about it or worry about it so much.
I would also add, I mean, we are the epicenter of technology here in San Francisco, right? And I think over this last, let's say, almost 10 years, but say 5 to 8 years, where it feels like we've rapidly adopted this willingly, I think it got to a point where citizens feel, it's really important that they can be in safe and kind of clean environments, right? So that they can thrive and do all this. And when it got to a point, I think for us in San Francisco, where we're like, wow, we are the epicenter here. We have these tools. We live them every day. Our computers, our phones, our this, our that, whatever that might be. Maybe even how we access our homes, with the retina and the this and the fingerprint and the whatever. Like, why is it that we can't create a safe environment in our downtown or on our bus or coming in on BART or whatever the thing is? And we started to question that. And I think we started to realize we need to get up to speed here in a way that is thoughtful. There's an example I want to give that, about, I'd say 15 years ago, there was this moment in just my own career, I think I noticed in the law enforcement space, that data-driven approaches to the work we were doing became a conversation piece. And this idea, and I think, Barry, you talked about this, was that if 100 years ago, you were dropped in a surgeon's in a hospital, right, with a surgery center, you would be like, wow, that's terrifying. And fast forward to today, you'd be like, look at the gadgets, this is nuts. I'm a doctor, I wouldn't be able to quite know where to go, where to begin, what to do. But if you took a person, let's just say in the courtroom or in law enforcement space 100 years ago, and you were there, you'd look around and you'd say, okay, here I am, this looks about the same, this looks about right, this is the same book, this is the same law, this is the thing. Fast forward, okay, maybe we made a few changes, but what I think has happened is that in the last blip, we've caught up just actually a bit. And we do need to be mindful about what we're doing in our surgery center. That is now like the norm for today. And so that was a conversation we were having with leaders at that time and pushing the envelope. But the envelope at that time was one surveillance camera and maybe a little more data because shows like CSI and whatever else were out. And it was showing that there's this world that exists and this data, this technology actually exists. And it is in the hands of people we should be terrified it's in the hands of. But, when it's us and it's our bottom line and it's our society and it's our city, this beloved place, and it's turning into something very different and we have the tools to fix it, it is actually our responsibility, I think, as citizens and as those in positions of, power to say, hey, we've got to make a change and we have the tools.
Yeah. Do you guys have anything that you see immediately on the horizon as kind of like the next big step for technology and the intersection with public safety?
This is a little off the point, but I was going to mention it earlier. One signal of either the effectiveness of tools like San Francisco is using or the enticement on the other side of the line is, so the street crime's really important. And I can't agree enough that public safety's like, you can't have anything else unless you have public safety. Like, that's just the absolute, if you want economic development, if you want to educate your kids properly. Gun violence just wrecks any ability to educate kids. There's lots of studies that show that even kids that are just near gun violence, they perform much less well in schools. But crime is what's moving online very quickly. That's the new technology area. The numbers in terms of cybercrime reports to the FBI, the economic damage of cybercrime is breathtaking. And I don't even know I've been very curious, but haven't explored the extent to which local PDs are going to handle that. I think There probably has to be a bigger federal role in that. But that's kind of the next frontier, I think, for the technologies, is actually protecting against cybercrime, because I'm sure we've all had experiences with people we know and love who've been hacked in different ways or defrauded.
Either one of you to want to talk about any new technologies that you're hoping for, what you see as like the next horizon?
Yeah, I think that for now, I don't think that we've fully leveraged even drones at this point. I think that, and Barry alluded to it a little bit, our drones, our TIC, is really kind of focused on an investigative kind of front. He mentioned it a little bit, drone as a first responder. I think there are more applications that we can leverage there, especially given the fact that, quite frankly, we're still over 500 officers under where we need to be. But there's data out there that other agencies are able to clear runs with drones, and I'd really like to explore that a little bit more, as far as us actually going to 911 calls, drone being the first responder, giving, at a minimum, more information to our officers, even on low-level runs. There are runs that we go to all the time that we use police officers to go there to look around and say, this is self-abated a while ago. In my view, not the most efficient way to use an officer. If a drone can go and do that, that would be huge for us.
And how do you see law enforcement technology helping with business in the future? What do you see as the next step there, or anything that you would hope to see more of that's already happening?
I think for us, it's how quickly technology is improving just within the technology we use. So surveillance technology, it's already dated, the cameras we put in however many years ago, and we want to make sure that there's infrastructure in place. So that's a cost thing. Getting people more and more just comfortable with the tools that we are using, for example, the drones, and having our cameras go straight to the real-time investigation center, tap in. What we're hearing more and more, I think, are people surprised. There was an accident the other day, for example, terrible fatality involving a truck and a person on a scooter, and realizing where are all the vantage points that exist in our community to be able to make sure that we capture this, and there are still blind spots. And that thought, if you're that person or that family, it's why isn't this fully blanketed? Why don't we have this? Not today, it's that sort of thing. So it's just continuing to improve on what we have, making sure we're staying within our lane, but at the same time, over time, slowly adopting to some things that could help us more and more in the future.
Are there any interesting crimes that have been solved in your view that you think we would have never gotten this one had technology not been there? Any specific examples you guys can think of?
I mean, I don't want to get into too many specifics, but there are definitely very serious crimes that we've had in the recent past that, in talking to the investigators, there would have been very, very little probability of a solve without the technology. I think that I'll just go back to kind of what we opened up with. We had at some point, I think 2017, we had over 30,000 auto boosts a year. You probably couldn't find very many San Franciscans didn't walk up to their car at some point and find some broken glass, right?
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of, maybe not scientific data, but I think there's strong anecdotal data that says that this technology really led to this massive decrease in the auto boost epidemic specifically. There's just like many crimes, there's a small amount of people that do the lion's share. And this technology allowed us to focus on those crews, as we call them, to the point where that 30,000, I think this year we're on pace for under 4,000, right around there anyways. The last 2 years, a 76% reduction. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And that has impacts throughout the kind of criminal community, but with, the folks that Marissa
Tourist.
deal with on a regular basis, right?
Oh yeah, just the visitors that wouldn't return.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
People were just afraid to park in garages, to park anywhere, to come here to visit, and that's all changed. And I want to actually stress one other important part. When you think of safety, you always think of, who we apprehend and the crime itself. But when you think about drone technology, this means fewer police officers and high-speed chase, right? And that means safety for everyone. It means just like being able to follow, somebody so clearly. It's an important change, I think. And maybe you want to speak to that, but I just think about protecting the officers, protecting the community. There are a lot of layers.
For sure. I mean, at its core, the ability to have air support, which we used to have a long time ago in the form of a helicopter. Now we've turbocharged it with a drone, greater efficiency, all those things. But yeah, I think at the core, we are now able to do things a lot more on our terms. We have a lot more information to give the cops as opposed to going blind. Our supervisors now have more information to make decisions on. Our officers know what's going on. So really, again, it's kind of endless in terms of the applications, but that's a great example of where we can use these tools to make everyone safer, the cops, the community, et cetera.
How unique is San Francisco in comparison with other large cities across the country in terms of its technology? And is it, are you in contact with other police agencies that are looking to also do something similar to a real-time investigation center?
Yeah, I mean, it's very commonplace at this point. Of course, there are different focuses. Like I said, we started off, it's a real-time investigation center, so a little bit more investigative bent to it. We're moving towards more patrol. But the general concepts are the same. I think where we differ a little bit is, again, policies and values and that sort of thing. We're trying to balance that as much as possible, where we're fully leveraging the technology impact where we can, but also just ensuring that people trust that we're doing it in a righteous manner.
Barry, what would you say about that?
So, the new fad, and some fads are good and some fads are bad, but is definitely real-time crime centers. And so, you get publications from policing organizations, and this is what everybody's talking about. I think there's a really wide range of use and sophistication, and I actually think San Francisco is relatively sophisticated in the way that it's using the tools. Some places got real-time crime centers and they're not doing very much. And in fact, if I can go off the lane here just a little bit, I want to point out that I was here right after the pandemic, and the change in the city's been dramatic. And I was here working not on technology, but on the city's system of community safety response, so using folks within the fire department to respond instead of the police when there are mental health calls and whatnot. And San Francisco at that time was unequivocally at the forefront of that work. And I don't know that that's the case now. I think the city's shifted its focus, and I regret that because I think you need all of it in a good, healthy ecosystem. So the chief points out correctly that San Francisco's down in the count of officers, and there are ways to substitute for those officers. There's lots of calls that the officers just aren't needed at, and you could use other responders, just like with the drones. I do think that you could do a lot with the drones in terms of first response. So it's easy to admire advances in certain directions, but regret things that aren't happening, and that's one I really think is too bad for the city.
I'm sorry, can you describe what you said that you were working with San Francisco Police and developing policies? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, we're just at the beginning, so I can only talk so much because I don't know anything. But we came out once and visited and looked at the Arctic, and then have an agreement to just sort of advise on ways that the policies can be developed in ways that I think accomplish what everybody on the stage seems to want to do, which is use the policies efficiently to help with public safety in the city, but also to make sure that we're avoiding the various risks that I outlined earlier.
All right. Did anybody want to give a closing comment of what you're hoping for in the future, or what you foresee in the future?
I mean, I will say, just from the business perspective, I think it's an incredibly positive environment right now as we're starting to see things change and feel safer. And we know that, to your point, Barry, our community we have a very discerning audience, right? San Franciscans are part of the conversation and they want to be part of the conversations. The Bay Area is also very discerning. So we're lucky in that way. I think that we're in an environment where we're held accountable. And I think that's a good thing. I also think that we've come out of a period where we're saying, let's not get in the way of ourselves, and let's make sure that we are able to be this sort of bastion of light and hope and innovation for our country, and continue to do that. I always say that San Francisco's greatest asset is its people, right? And who we attract here, and who want to be here, and who want to be innovating here. And we always talk about all the great things that come from San Francisco. And I think this is an area where we can really show best practices and bring in thought leaders like Barry and others to come in and help us see where we are blind and see how we can get there, but making sure we keep trying to get there. Because we've seen what happens when we get too much, I think, in our way, and we're too afraid of things, and we're stalled, and we shouldn't be. We should be celebrating all these great technologies. We should be understanding there are risks. We should be understanding how to prevent. We're not trying to replace people, for example. We think they're our biggest asset. We're not trying to get ahead of ourselves. We're always talking about being on the right side of history around law enforcement. And so I think if we maintain that integrity, we maintain the communication and the transparency, I think we will get there and be able to kind of celebrate those wins in the long run.
Yeah, I think in that vein, you mentioned it a little bit. I want to tell San Francisco it's okay to embrace the technology. I think part of that is, we really try to be transparent with the good and the bad, right? Because we want people to know that we're doing this the right way. I think a lot of people have seen our social media. That is by design. It's not, we're just highlighting one case here and there. What we're trying to show as a department is these are all the good things that come along with the technology when used in a right way. And I think that's part of why people, see that footage and say, wow, they're doing things that I never thought they could do. And they're doing it efficiently and in a smart way, and, while being mindful to what San Francisco believes in. And then the other side of that is just understanding that that is our mindset when something comes up, and there are going to be issues along the way. We've seen that already, that we're going to treat that in a transparent way as well, right? So handling that good side and the bad side, but that in the end, it's really about impacting public safety in the most positive way that we can.
I've heard the word transparency a lot. I think it's an important word. The work that the Policing Project has done for years has been around making sure that communities and the people at large have a voice in how they're policed. And I think that's essential, and trust is a core part of that. And I often say to people, you have relationships in your own life, and there's no trust where there's no transparency. Like, secrets don't really help relationships develop. I think we're pleased to have the opportunity to look at what San Francisco is doing and help in ways that put guardrails in place, but at the same time, it does go both ways, and I think we're appreciative to see what San Francisco is doing. Some of what I saw was, really interesting compared to other Arctics, for example, and it's only by understanding what policing agencies are doing and what technologies that they're using that we can then, as a community, say, are we good with that? Are we not good with that? We're good with it, but we want these kind of protections in place. And so you need to have that, I can't remember, I think it was Marissa used the word about a constant conversation or dialogue, and I think that's essential.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about everything that we talked about in the near future.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I want to thank our speakers this afternoon, Marissa, Derek, and Barry, for their thoughtful insights on this important topic, balancing public safety and civil liberties in the age of technology. And Megan, thank you for facilitating this important moderated discussion. It's very timely and very important. And I'd like to lastly thank our audience for joining us virtually this afternoon, and supporting the Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Thank you so much.